The tarmac at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey was a black mirror, slick with the remnants of a midnight rain that smelled of jet fuel and damp earth. It was 0300 hours, 1962. At the height of the Cold War, the world was a powder keg, and the men who flew out of the darkness were the ones holding the matches. The hangar doors groaned open, revealing the silhouette of a bird that shouldn't have been able to fly. The Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady was a spindly, fragile-looking thing, all wing and no weight. It sat on the runway like a giant black cross, its 80-foot wingspan drooping toward the ground, supported by pogos, tiny bicycle wheels that would fall away the moment the aircraft took flight. Inside the sterile preparation room, Captain Thomas Hale sat motionless as technicians bolted him into a pressurized suit. It was a claustrophobic ritual. If the cockpit lost pressure at the edges of space, the nitrogen in his blood would boil and his skin would expand until it met the resistance of the heavy canvas suit. To the technicians, he was a specimen. To the Air Force, he was a ghost. Hale sipped pure oxygen through a mask, purging his system to prevent the bends. He thought about his wife, Sarah, asleep in their bungalow back in the States, believing he was on a routine weather reconnaissance deployment. He thought about the flight log he had signed 10 minutes ago. It was the only legal record that Thomas Hale existed this morning. By the time he reached his cruising altitude, even that record would be moved to a vault with a clearance level higher than the president's. The mission had a designation: Operation Midnight Sun. The target was a specific corridor of the Eurasian landmass that hadn't been surveyed since the end of the Great War. It was a blind spot in the CIA's eye, a region of jagged peaks and desolate plateaus where the Soviet Union was rumored to be testing something that defied conventional physics. "Oxygen check, 5 by 5, Hale's voice crackled through the comms. "Copy, Dragon 1. Clear for taxi. Remember, Captain, if the engine dies, you're a glider. If you go down, you're a tourist who got lost. Don't use the radio unless the world is ending." Hale taxied the U-2 onto the runway. He felt the immense power of the Pratt & Whitney J57 engine vibrating through his spine. With a roar that tore through the Turkish night, he pushed the throttle forward. The U-2 didn't just take off, it leaped. Within seconds, the pogos fell away, bouncing harmlessly on the tarmac, and Hale was climbing at an angle that would have stalled any other jet in the world. Below him, the lights of the base faded into a tiny pinprick. Above him, the stars were cold and unforgiving. By morning, a press release was already drafted in Washington, D.C., ready to be issued if he didn't return. It spoke of a lost weather pilot, a navigational error, and a tragic accident. It was a eulogy for a flight that, according to the official history of the United States, never happened. The U-2 ascended into a realm where the laws of the Earth began to dissolve. At 70,000 feet, the sky isn't blue. It is a deep, bruised violet that fades into the absolute black of the void. For Captain Thomas Hale, the world below had become an abstract painting. Borders, those lines drawn by politicians and defended by armies, became invisible. From this height, there was no difference between the Soviet Union and the neutral territories of the East. There was only the land, the ice, and the silence. He was flying in what the pilots called the coffin corner. At this extreme altitude, the margin between the aircraft's maximum speed, where it would shake apart, and its stall speed, where it would fall out of the sky, was a razor-thin gap of only a few knots. He was walking a tightrope in a pressurized suit 13 miles above the ground. Hale adjusted his heading. He was now crossing into an A zone, a target corridor that officially did not exist on any public map. This wasn't just a classified location, it was a geographic anomaly.
Intelligence suggested the Soviets had erased this entire mountain range from their own civilian maps to hide a massive underground complex. But as Hale looked through the drift sight, the high-powered telescope that allowed him to see the ground, his brow furrowed. "Navigation check," he whispered to himself, though no one was listening. His internal navigation system, the pinnacle of 1960s technology, began to oscillate. The needle on his compass didn't just spin, it vibrated as if it were trying to point in 3 directions at once. He looked down at his charts, then back through the lens. The ground features didn't match the reconnaissance photos provided by the CIA. Where there should have been a valley, there was a jagged ridge. Where there should have been a dry lake bed, there was a shimmering, iridescent mist that seemed to swallow the light. As if the Earth itself were shifting, or as if he had flown into a version of reality that hadn't been rendered correctly. "Dragon 1, to home base, do you read?" Only static answered him, a thick rhythmic pulsing of radio interference that sounded like a heartbeat. He was alone in a blank zone, a place where the maps were useless and the instruments were lying. He felt a cold sweat prickle his skin inside the pressure suit. It wasn't just the equipment, it was the atmosphere. The air at this height should have been still, yet the U-2 was buffeted by sudden violent jolts of turbulence, clear air pockets that felt like the hand of a giant swatting at the plane. The sky was behaving strangely. The stars above him seemed to shimmer with a green hue, and for a moment Hale had the terrifying sensation that he wasn't flying over the Earth at all, but on a mirror of it. 12 miles up, there is no sound but the hum of the life support system and the distant roar of the engine. It is the most lonely place a human being can go. Hale was checking his fuel reserves when he noticed a flicker on the edge of his peripheral vision. He looked at the radar scope, a primitive screen by modern standards, but sensitive enough to pick up a bird. There was a blip. It wasn't behind him, it wasn't below him, it was above him. Hale froze. The U-2 was the highest flying aircraft in existence. The Soviets had nothing that could reach this ceiling. Their MiGs would flame out and stall thousands of feet below him, gasping for air that wasn't there. Even the surface-to-air missiles of the era struggled to reach this dead zone. He looked up through the canopy. There, etched against the blackness of the upper stratosphere, was a shape. It was sleek, dark, and possessed a geometry that felt wrong to the eye, too many sharp angles, yet seemingly seamless. It kept pace with him, perhaps 5,000 feet higher. There were no contrails, no glowing exhaust from a jet engine, no visible means of propulsion. "Dragon 1, to unknown craft," Hale said, his voice trembling. "You are in restricted airspace. Identify yourself." Silence. The heartbeat static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. Hale pushed his U-2 to its absolute limit, risking a stall to see if he could close the gap. The unknown craft didn't accelerate, it drifted. It moved with a fluid, effortless grace that made the U-2 feel like a lead sled. It mimicked his movements perfectly. If Hale dipped a wing, the shadow above him dipped its wing. He remembered the CIA briefing in the windowless room at Langley. "Nothing else flies where you're going, Captain. If you see something, it's a hallucination brought on by hypoxia. You ignore it. You focus on the camera." But this wasn't a hallucination. The camera was rolling, the high-resolution film whirring in the belly of the plane, capturing the terrain below, and, if Hale could tilt the craft, perhaps the predator above. The object began to descend. It didn't dive, it simply lowered itself through the thin air like a leaf falling in a vacuum. It drew closer until Hale could see the skin of the craft. It didn't look like metal, it looked like polished obsidian, reflecting the dim light of the distant sun in a way that made it seem to disappear and reappear as it moved. There were no markings, no red star, no USF roundel. Suddenly, the object banked. It crossed directly in front of Hale's nose, an impossible maneuver at that altitude. The wake turbulence should have flipped the U-2 and sent it into a terminal spin, but there was no turbulence. The air didn't move. Hale stared through the glass, his breath fogging his visor. For a split second, as the craft leveled out alongside him, he looked across the void. He expected to see a cockpit, a pilot, a face. Instead, he saw a window into a void. The craft seemed to be hollow, or perhaps it was a mirror reflecting the empty space around it. And then it was gone. It didn't fly away, it didn't accelerate into the distance, it simply ceased to be in the space it had occupied. The radar scope went clean, the heartbeat static died, replaced by the hiss of empty air. Hale was alone again. His instruments snapped back to life. The compass pointed north. The navigation system hummed.
The descent from 70,000 feet is a slow, agonizing slide back into the heavy embrace of the world. For Captain Thomas Hale, the transition felt like a betrayal. The air grew thick and turbulent. The violet sky bled back into a pale, deceptive blue. When the U-2's long, glider-like wings finally caught the dense air of the lower atmosphere, Hale felt the weight of his own body again, the crushing gravity of a reality he no longer quite trusted. He touched down at Incirlik under the shroud of a moonless sky. The chase car, a high-powered Ford used to guide the U-2 during its notoriously difficult landing, screeched alongside him. But the usual camaraderie was absent. There were no pats on the back, there was no hot coffee waiting in the ready room. Instead, the aircraft was swarmed by men in suits who didn't belong to the Air Force. Before Hale had even unbuckled his harness, the camera bays in the belly of the Dragon Lady were being pried open. The massive canisters of 70mm film, miles of high-resolution acetate that had captured the blank zone, were whisked away into a waiting black transport plane. Hale was ushered into a windowless room for processing. He was still wearing the sweat-soaked, pressurized suit, his face creased by the oxygen mask, when the first whispers reached him. 6 hours later, in a basement laboratory at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NIPC, in Washington, the film was developed in total darkness. The analysts were used to seeing grainy silos, camouflaged runways, and the occasional battleship. They were men trained to find needles in haystacks of forest and snow. But as the reels moved through the chemicals and the first clear prints were pinned to the light tables, the room went silent. It wasn't a Soviet ICBM site. It wasn't a radar array or a hidden submarine pen. In the center of the blank zone, that geographic anomaly Hale had struggled to navigate, sat a structure. It was a massive geometric complex that defied the brutalist architecture of the Soviet era. It was a series of concentric obsidian rings, hundreds of feet wide, perfectly symmetrical, and etched into a plateau so remote that the temperature never rose above freezing. There were no roads leading to it, no power lines, no support barracks. The light in the photograph seemed to bend around the edges of the rings, creating a shimmering distortion similar to the mist Hale had seen from the cockpit. One senior analyst, a veteran of the Cuban Missile Crisis, who had looked at 1,000,000 miles of reconnaissance film, dropped his magnifying loupe. His hands were shaking. "If this is real," he whispered, his voice cracking in the sterile air, "then everything we know about Russian engineering is a lie. Or worse, we're not supposed to see this because it isn't Russian at all." The photograph showed more than just the structure. It captured the shadow of the object Hale had seen in the sky, a dark, angular shape positioned directly above the center of the rings. The image was undeniable. It was proof of a technology that existed outside the known Cold War arms race.
By sunrise, the order came down from the highest levels of the executive branch. The film was to be incinerated, not archived, not classified, destroyed. The machinery of the American government is a vast grinding engine, and when it chooses to move, it can flatten the truth into a thin, unrecognizable sheet. Within 48 hours of Hale's landing, Operation Midnight Sun ceased to exist. In the official records rooms of the Pentagon and the CIA, the folders were purged. The mission designation was scrubbed and replaced with a mundane tag, Flight Path 402, Atmospheric Sampling. The flight logs were the first to change. The coordinates Hale had punched into his navigation system, those impossible degrees and minutes, were overwritten with a standard route over the Black Sea. The fuel records were corrected to reflect a much shorter flight. The blank zone was once again just a gap in the clouds on a weather map. Hale was flown to a black site in Virginia. He wasn't met by a general or a doctor, but a man in a gray suit who didn't offer a name. "Captain," the man said, sliding a stack of papers across a metal table, "you had a long flight. High altitude does strange things to the human brain. Hypoxia is a subtle thief. It steals your logic and replaces it with dreams." "I have the film logs," Hale said, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "There is no film, Captain. There was a camera malfunction over the target area. All we recovered was static and light leaks. You flew a routine weather mission. You sampled the air for radioactive isotopes from Soviet tests. You saw nothing but clouds and stars." Hale looked at the papers. They were silence agreements, National Security Act non-disclosure forms that carried the weight of life imprisonment. But they were more than that. They were a confession of delusion. By signing them, Hale was agreeing that his own memory was a symptom of a medical breakdown. "The logs I signed at Incirlik," Hale began. "Have been replaced," the man in the suit interrupted. "The man who signed those logs was a Captain Thomas Hale who was grounded 3 months ago for a heart murmur. You are a different man now. You can choose to be the man who retired honorably after a quiet career, or you can be the man who never existed." Hale looked at the pen. He thought of the obsidian rings and the way the light had bent around them. He thought of the silent, dark craft that had moved through the stratosphere like a needle through silk. He realized then that the Cold War wasn't just a battle of ideologies, it was a battle for the definition of reality. He signed the papers. As he walked out of the room, he saw a janitor buffing the floors. The man didn't look up. The world was moving on, the gears of the great lie already turning, ensuring that the most important discovery in human history would remain a ghost in the machinery. Thomas Hale returned to civilian life in late 1962, but he didn't return to the world he had left. He moved back to a quiet suburb in Ohio, taking a job as a consultant for an aerospace firm. To his neighbors, he was a retired Air Force officer, a man who had seen some things, sure, but nothing more than the usual scraps of the Cold War. There was no medal for his final flight. There was no reprimand in his file. There was simply nothing. The erasure was surgical. A few years after his return, Hale attempted to apply for a specialized medical benefit related to high-altitude radiation exposure. When the Veterans Administration requested his records, the response was a bureaucratic shrug. They had no record of a Captain Thomas Hale serving at Incirlik in 1962. According to his official file, he had spent that year at a desk in South Carolina, performing administrative duties. He reached out to his old wingmen. Some didn't return his calls. One, a man he had flown with for 5 years, met him for a drink at a dimly lit VFW hall. "Tom, I don't know what you're talking about. You were grounded in 61, remember? The flight surgeon found that flutter in your chest. You never went to Turkey." Hale realized the depth of the shadow. They hadn't just destroyed the documents, they had reconditioned the people. They had moved the pieces of the past around until the puzzle no longer showed his face. He spent the rest of his life in a strange, quiet purgatory. He would sit in his backyard on clear nights, looking up at the bruised violet purple of the twilight, knowing that 13 miles up, the laws of physics were being broken by things the world wasn't allowed to know. The government didn't need to put Hale in a cell. They had built a prison out of his own life. They had turned him into a living lie, a man whose greatest achievement was a secret he wasn't even allowed to remember. In 1998, shortly before his death, Hale sat down with his grandson. He didn't tell him about the U-2's specifications or the politics of the 1960s. He told him about a place where the maps ended and the sky turned into a mirror. He spoke of the obsidian rings and the craft with no exhaust. "They'll tell you it was a dream," Hale whispered, his eyes clear and sharp even in his final days. "They'll tell you the world is small and mapped and known. But I saw the blank zone, and in the blank zone, we are never as alone as they want us to believe." When Thomas Hale passed away, his obituary listed him as a dedicated family man and a former clerk in the United States Air Force. The flight that never existed had finally claimed its pilot. But somewhere in a vault that doesn't appear on any blueprint, in a building with no name, a single strip of 70mm film still exists, a silent witness to the morning the world was denied the truth. History is often written in the margins, and for decades the truth of Operation Midnight Sun remained trapped in the rusted filing cabinets of a crumbling empire. It wasn't until the early 1990s
The logs recorded a primary target, a high-altitude, slow-moving contact, consistent with a Lockheed U-2. The Soviets knew the Dragon Lady well. They had shot down Francis Gary Powers only 2 years prior, and their radar operators were trained to recognize the specific, flickering return of the U-2's narrow fuselage at the very ceiling of the sky. But on that specific morning, the radar screens at a remote Siberian outpost showed something that defied the manual. A second blip had appeared. It didn't emerge from a known airbase, nor did it cross the border. It simply materialized within the blank zone, appearing directly above the U-2. The logs indicated that this second object was traveling at a velocity that should have been impossible for any sustained flight at 75,000 feet. It wasn't just fast, it was stationary one moment and moving at Mach 4 the next, without any discernible acceleration curve. In the corner of the logbook, beneath a series of complex altitude calculations, a young technician named Viktor Volkov had scrawled a note in hurried Cyrillic. "American plane not alone. Secondary contact maintains vertical stagger. No thermal signature detected on infrared." Hours later, a heavy line of black ink was drawn through Volkov's observation. A superior stamp was pressed over it. Technical malfunction, sensor ghosting. Volkov was reassigned to a coastal station in the Arctic Circle 2 weeks later. The Soviet records confirmed what the American government had spent decades denying. The blank zone wasn't just a place where the CIA was hiding a secret, it was a place where both superpowers were witnessing something that neither could control. For the Soviets to admit they were tracking a craft that could outmaneuver their best interceptors was an admission of weakness they couldn't afford. For the Americans to admit they were being shadowed was an admission of a security breach that defied the laws of physics. The silence was mutual. It was the only thing the two enemies could agree on. Some truths were too dangerous for the public, no matter which side of the Iron Curtain they lived on. To understand why the denial of Hale's mission was so absolute, one must understand the fragile architecture of the Cold War. In 1962, the world was a chessboard where every move was calculated to project strength. A crack in that projection was more dangerous than a nuclear warhead. Years later, internal memos from the Office of Scientific Intelligence began to leak through the cracks of time. These documents didn't speak of aliens or UFOs. The language was colder, more clinical. They spoke of unacknowledged atmospheric anomalies and non-standard structural signatures. The memos revealed a terrifying realization within the halls of Langley. Admitting that Thomas Hale completed his mission meant admitting three things that would have shattered the American narrative. First, it meant acknowledging the existence of the A-zone, an air corridor where the physical properties of the atmosphere seemed to fluctuate, possibly due to the massive geometric structure Hale had photographed. To admit this was to admit that there were regions of the Earth that the United States did not understand and could not map. Second, the structure itself, the obsidian rings, represented a technology that bypassed the entire industrial evolution of the 20th century. If the Soviets had built it, the Cold War was already lost. If the Soviets hadn't built it, then a third party was operating on Earth with total impunity. Third, and perhaps most disturbing to the military mind, was the impossible track. The craft that shadowed Hale proved that American airspace and the vacuum-like heights above it was not secure. The U-2 was the ultimate shield, the eye in the sky that gave the U.S. the high ground. If something could dance around a U-2 like it was standing still, the high ground was a myth. The truth didn't fit the Cold War narrative of two superpowers locked in a struggle for global dominance. It introduced a wild card, a variable that made the nuclear arms race look like a playground dispute. So the mission was buried. It was buried under layers of falsified medical records, rewritten flight logs, and the ruined reputation of a loyal pilot. The government realized that it was better to have a pilot who thought he was crazy than a public that knew it was defenseless. The denial wasn't a cover-up of a failure. It was a cover-up of a reality that the human mind in 1962 was not prepared to process.